Every parent's worst nightmare is losing a child and never knowing what happened to them. For Jeremiah Pike, that nightmare became 30 years of silent torment in the mountains of Montana. When his dog started barking at a hollow tree, Jeremiah found something that changed everything. Inside that rotted trunk was his daughter's doll, the same one she held the day she vanished. For 3 decades, he'd searched every inch of these mountains. Now the forest was giving up its secret, but finding that doll was just the beginning. The truth about what happened to his little girl was darker than anything Jeremiah could have imagined. And now, after all these years of running from the past, he'd have to face it head-on. What really happened to his daughter all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine needles like old memories, reluctant to let go. Jeremiah Pike stood 6 feet tall in his worn leather boots, his frame still solid, despite the 72 years that had carved deep lines around his gray eyes. The Montana wilderness had been his sanctuary for 2 decades now, a place where a man could disappear from the world and let the world forget him right back. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of towering ponderosa pines, 15 miles from the nearest neighbor and 30 from the closest town. The structure was simple but well built. Logs chinked tight against the mountain cold, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows positioned to catch the first light of dawn. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a man who'd learned to live with less than he'd once thought possible. Boone, his blue-tick coonhound, had been his only companion for the past 8 years. The dog was getting on in years himself, his muzzle gone silver and his joints stiff on cold mornings. But his nose remained sharp, as the day Jeremiah had found him as a pup, half-starved and abandoned on the mountain road. They understood each other, man and dog, both carrying scars from a world that had taken more than it gave. The routine of their days followed the rhythm of the seasons. Wake before sunrise, tend the small garden that provided vegetables through the growing months, check the snares that supplemented their diet with rabbit and grouse. In winter, they'd hole up with enough firewood and preserved food to last until the snows melted. It was a simple life, deliberately so, but 30 years ago Jeremiah Pike had been a different man entirely. Back then, he'd worn a sheriff's badge in the valley town of Cedar Falls, 20 miles down the mountain from where he now made his home. He'd been married to Sarah, a schoolteacher with auburn hair and a laugh that could fill a room. They'd had a daughter, Emma, born when the century was young, and their hopes were high as the mountain peaks that surrounded their valley. Emma had been the light of their world, a bright, curious child with her mother's quick mind and her father's stubborn streak. She'd follow him around town on his rounds, chattering about everything she saw, asking questions that made him see his work through fresh eyes. The townsfolk had called her Little Deputy, and Jeremiah had worn that title like a badge of honor. The memory of that last day remained as clear as mountain air, though he'd spent 30 years trying to blur its edges. It'd been October. The aspens turned gold, and the first frost threatening in the high country. Sarah had taken Emma to gather wild berries in the foothills, a tradition they'd started when the girl was barely old enough to walk. They'd done it dozens of times before, always staying on the well-marked trails that wound through the lower elevations. But that day, something had gone wrong. Sarah had returned alone as the sun was setting, her face white with panic, her voice breaking as she told him how Emma had wandered off while they were picking huckleberries near Willow Creek. She turned around for just a moment. She said, just long enough to move to a better patch of bushes, and when she looked back, Emma was gone. The search had consumed weeks. Every able-bodied man in the county had joined the effort, combing through every draw, every canyon, every hidden valley within 50 miles. They'd brought in tracking dogs from Denver, expert woodsmen from the Crow Reservation, even a few old-timers who claimed they could read sign like a book. But the mountain had swallowed Emma Pike without leaving so much as a footprint to follow. As autumn turned to winter, the searchers had gradually drifted back to their own lives. The official investigation was closed after 3 months, filed away as a tragic accident, a child lost to the wilderness, as had happened before and would happen again. But Jeremiah had never stopped looking. Even as the years passed and hope faded to a bitter ember in his chest, he'd continued his solitary searches, following every rumor, chasing every possibility, refusing to accept what everyone else had long since acknowledged. The cost had been everything he'd once held dear. Sarah had tried to rebuild their life, to move forward in the way that survivors must, but Jeremiah couldn't let go. His obsession with finding Emma had consumed him, driving a wedge between him and his wife that grew wider with each passing season. She'd pleaded with him to stop, to accept what had happened and try to heal. But he couldn't hear her through the roar of his own pain. Sarah had finally left him 7 years after Emma's disappearance, taking nothing but a single suitcase and a letter that he'd read so many times the paper had worn thin. She'd written about love that couldn't survive the weight of unresolved grief, about the necessity of choosing life over the pursuit of ghosts. He'd understood her reasons, even respected them, but understanding hadn't made the loss hurt any less. The town had eventually elected a new sheriff. Jeremiah had turned in his badge without ceremony, sold his house for far less than it was worth, and disappeared into the high country where he now made his home. He'd told himself he was retreating to heal, but healing had never really been the point. He'd come here to hide, to nurse his wounds in solitude, to wait for the mountain to give up its secrets or claim him in the trying. The people of Cedar Falls had long since stopped expecting to see Jeremiah Pike in town. Once or twice a year, he'd make the journey down to trade pelts and preserved meat for supplies he couldn't make or grow himself. But those visits were brief and conducted with the minimum of conversation necessary. The newer residents didn't know who he was, and the old-timers had learned not to ask questions about the hermit who lived up in the timber. But the mountain remembered everything. It remembered the desperate searches, the countless expeditions into its hidden places, the way a father's love had driven him to explore every shadow and hollow in his endless quest. And perhaps, in its ancient patience, it had been waiting for the right moment to speak. This morning had started like any other. Jeremiah had risen before dawn, as was his habit, and stepped outside to breathe the thin, clean air that came before sunrise. Boone had emerged from his sleeping spot under the cabin's covered porch, stretching and shaking off the night's chill. Together, they'd begun their morning routine, checking the small clearing where Jeremiah grew his vegetables, examining the snares he'd set along the game trails that crisscrossed his property. It was during this familiar circuit that Boone had suddenly stopped. His head lifted and nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that made his hackles rise. The dog had moved with purpose toward a section of forest where an old ponderosa pine had fallen sometime during the previous winter, its massive trunk creating a bridge across a small ravine. Weather and time had hollowed out much of the tree's interior, leaving it like a tunnel through the fallen giant. Boone had approached the hollow log with an intensity Jeremiah hadn't seen in years, whining and pawing at the opening while looking back at his master with eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. It was unusual behavior for the old hound, who typically reserved such excitement for the scent of fresh game or the occasional intrusion of bears or mountain lions into their territory. Curious but not alarmed, Jeremiah had approached the fallen tree to see what had captured his companion's attention. The opening was large enough for a man to crawl through, though the interior was dark and filled with the musty smell of decay and years of accumulated debris. He'd knelt beside the entrance, peering into the shadows, while Boone continued his agitated circling, and that's when he'd seen it, a splash of color that didn't belong to the natural palette of the forest floor. Jeremiah's weathered hands trembled as he reached into the hollow darkness of the fallen pine. The fabric was soft beneath his fingers, softer than anything had a right to be after 3 decades of mountain weather. He pulled gently, and the bundle came free with surprising ease, as if the tree had been waiting patiently to give up its secret. The doll emerged first, a small thing made of cloth and stuffing, its features faded but still recognizable. Brown yarn hair hung in tangled strands around a face that had once been painted with rosy cheeks and bright blue eyes. One eye was missing now, leaving a small hole that seemed to stare accusingly at the morning sky. But it was the blue shawl wrapped around the doll that stopped Jeremiah's breath in his throat. He'd bought that shawl for Emma's 6th birthday, a soft wool thing that Sarah had admired in the window of Morrison's general store. Emma had loved it immediately, declaring it the perfect blanket for her favorite doll, this very doll that now lay cradled in his shaking hands. She'd named the doll Rebecca and had carried it everywhere, wrapped in that blue shawl, talking to it in the serious way children do when they believe their toys can hear every word. The last time he'd seen both doll and shawl, Emma had been clutching them tight as she and Sarah headed out for their berry-picking expedition. When Sarah had returned alone, frantic and tear-stained, she'd mentioned the doll, how Emma had been playing with Rebecca near the berry bushes, setting up an elaborate tea party on a fallen log while Sarah worked nearby. For 30 years, Jeremiah had assumed the doll had been lost with Emma, perhaps dropped somewhere in the vast wilderness during whatever had befallen his daughter. He'd even looked for it during his countless searches, thinking that finding Rebecca might provide a clue to Emma's fate. But the mountains had kept their silence, offering nothing but false hopes and dead ends. Now, holding the doll in his hands, Jeremiah felt something crack open inside his chest, a fissure in the stone walls he'd built around his heart. His knees gave way, and he sank to the forest floor, his broad shoulders shaking with sobs that came from a place so deep he'd forgotten it existed. Boone whined softly and pressed against his master's side, offering the only comfort he could give. The doll smelled of earth and pine sap. But underneath those scents was something else, something that might have been a trace of the lavender soap Sarah had always used, the same soap she'd washed Emma's clothes with every week. It was impossible, of course. 30 years would have erased any such delicate trace. But the memory was so strong that Jeremiah could almost convince himself it was real. As his tears fell onto the faded fabric, questions began flooding his mind. How had the doll come to be here, 15 miles from where Emma had disappeared? This fallen tree was nowhere near Willow Creek, nowhere near the hiking trails where the searches had been concentrated. It was deep in backcountry that few people ever visited, accessible only by game trails and paths that required real woodcraft to navigate. More troubling still was the condition of the doll itself. While clearly aged and weathered, it wasn't the tattered ruin he would have expected from 3 decades of exposure to mountain weather. The hollow tree had protected it, certainly, but even so, the fabric should have been more deteriorated, the stuffing more compressed. It was as if the doll had only recently been placed here, though that seemed impossible. Jeremiah forced himself to examine the hollow tree more carefully, his law enforcement training finally overriding the emotional chaos in his mind. The interior of the fallen pine was larger than he'd initially realized, wide enough for a man to crawl through comfortably. The wood was soft with rot, and generations of small animals had clearly used the space as shelter. But there, near where he'd found the doll, the debris had been disturbed recently. Someone had been here. Someone had placed Rebecca in this specific spot, wrapped in that precious blue shawl, and left her for Boone to find. But who, and why now after all these years? The implications began settling over him like mountain fog, heavy, obscuring, and impossible to ignore. If someone had deliberately placed the doll here, it meant they knew about Emma's disappearance. More than that, it meant they had kept the doll all these years, preserved it, cared for it. The thought sent a chill down Jeremiah's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Had Emma's disappearance not been the random tragedy everyone had assumed? Had someone taken his daughter, kept her doll as some twisted memento, and now decided to torment him with this discovery? The possibility was too horrible to fully contemplate, yet he couldn't push it away. Jeremiah stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. He held the doll close to his chest, protective instincts he'd thought long dead, suddenly roaring back to life. Whatever game someone was playing, whatever message they were trying to send, he wouldn't let them hurt Emma again, even if Emma was only a memory now, but another possibility whispered at the edges of his consciousness, one even more difficult to accept. What if Emma wasn't just a memory? What if, somehow impossibly, she was still alive? The doll's condition suggested it hadn't been exposed to the elements for 30 years. What if someone had kept both the doll and the girl all this time? The thought was too enormous to hold steady. Emma would be 36 years old now, a grown woman with a life of her own. Would she even remember her father? Remember the man who had failed to protect her when she needed him most? Would she remember this doll, this shawl, the birthday when he'd given it to her with such pride? Boone barked once, sharp and demanding, drawing Jeremiah's attention back to the present moment. The dog was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking down the mountain, with his ears pricked forward. Someone was coming, still distant, but moving up the game trail that led to Jeremiah's cabin. In all his years on the mountain, unexpected visitors had been rare. The isolation he'd chosen was nearly complete, broken only by his own infrequent trips to town and the occasional lost hiker who'd wandered too far from the marked trails. The timing of this visit, coming so soon after his discovery of the doll, couldn't be coincidence. Jeremiah tucked Rebecca carefully inside his jacket, the doll's small form pressed against his heart. Whatever was coming, whoever was climbing toward his sanctuary, he would be ready. The mountain had kept its secrets long enough. Now, it seemed, the time for hiding was over. He walked back toward his cabin with purposeful strides, Boone trotting alongside him with the alert posture of a dog who sensed his master's sudden change in mood. The morning that had begun like any other had become something else entirely, a moment of reckoning that Jeremiah had both dreaded and longed for throughout all his years of exile. Behind them, the hollow tree lay empty now, its secret finally given up to the wind and the watching forest. But in Jeremiah's jacket, Rebecca waited patiently, just as she had for 30 years, to help him find his way back to the truth about what had happened to the little girl who had loved her so much. The sound of approaching footsteps grew clearer now, measured and deliberate, as if the visitor knew exactly where they were going. Jeremiah reached his cabin porch and turned to face the trail, his hand resting on the doll through the fabric of his jacket. After 3 decades of silence, the mountain was finally ready to speak, and Jeremiah Pike, carved from granite though he was, stood ready to listen. The woman who emerged from the tree line moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to rough terrain. She appeared to be in her late 30s, tall and lean, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her clothes were well-worn hiking gear, sturdy boots, canvas pants, and a jacket that had seen many seasons in the mountains. But it was her eyes that gave Jeremiah pause, green eyes that seemed familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with recognition he couldn't quite place. She stopped at the edge of his clearing, hands visible and empty, respecting the unspoken rules of approaching a mountain dweller's home. Boone had positioned himself between her and Jeremiah, not growling but alert, waiting for his master's signal. "Mr. Pike," her voice carried clearly in the thin air, pitched low and respectful. "My name is Catherine Mills. I was hoping we could talk." Jeremiah studied her face, searching for the source of that nagging familiarity. Something about the shape of her jawline, the way she held her head slightly tilted when she spoke. His hand pressed unconsciously against the doll hidden beneath his jacket. "Don't get many visitors up here," he said finally, his voice rusty from disuse. "Especially ones who know my name." Catherine took a small step forward, then stopped when Boone's ears flattened slightly. She was smart enough to read the dog's signals. "I know this is unexpected. I know you value your privacy. But I have information about Emma." The name hit him like a physical blow. For 30 years, no one had spoken his daughter's name in his presence. Even during his infrequent trips to town, the old-timers who remembered would avert their eyes, speaking around the subject with careful politeness. Hearing it now from this stranger's lips made the world tilt slightly on its axis. Emma's been gone 30 years. Jeremiah said, his voice carefully controlled. Nothing to talk about anymore. She's not gone. Catherine's words were quiet but firm. She's been looking for you. The statement hung in the mountain air like morning mist, impossible to grasp but undeniably present. Jeremiah felt his knees threaten to buckle again, the way they had when he'd first pulled the doll from the hollow tree. He gripped the porch railing with his free hand, grateful for its solid support. "That's not possible," he whispered. Catherine reached slowly into her jacket pocket, telegraphing her movements to avoid startling either man or dog. She withdrew a photograph, old and creased, the kind taken with instant cameras that had been popular decades ago. She held it up where Jeremiah could see it from the porch. Even at this distance, he recognized the image immediately. It was a picture Sarah had taken during Emma's 7th birthday party, just months before she'd disappeared. Emma was seated at their kitchen table, wearing the blue dress Sarah had sewn for the occasion, her face bright with laughter as she opened presents. Jeremiah remembered the moment. He'd been making faces behind Sarah's shoulder to get Emma to smile for the camera. "Where did you get that?" His voice was barely audible. From Emma herself. "She's kept it all these years." Catherine lowered the photograph but didn't put it away. "Mr. Pike, your daughter is alive. She's been alive this whole time." The words should have filled him with joy, should have sent him running down the mountain toward whatever reunion awaited. Instead, they raised 1,000 questions that clawed at his mind like trapped animals. If Emma was alive, where had she been? Why hadn't she come home? Why had she let him suffer for 3 decades believing she was dead? "If that's true," Jeremiah said slowly, "then why didn't she come herself? Why send you?" Catherine's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. "Because she's afraid you won't forgive her." Forgive her? The question exploded from him with more force than he'd intended. Forgive her for what? She was 6 years old. Whatever happened to her wasn't her fault? No, Catherine agreed quietly. It wasn't. But what happened afterward, that's more complicated. She gestured toward the cabin's porch, where 2 old chairs sat side by side, relics from the life he'd lived before retreat and isolation. "Could we sit?" "This isn't a conversation for standing in a clearing." Jeremiah hesitated. 3 decades of solitude had taught him caution, and this woman's arrival, so soon after his discovery of the doll, seemed too convenient to be coincidence. But the photograph in her hand, the way she spoke Emma's name with such certainty, these things suggested she was telling the truth. However impossible it seemed, he nodded toward the chairs, and Catherine approached slowly, giving Boone time to accept her presence. The old hound settled at Jeremiah's feet as they both took seats, his eyes fixed on the stranger, but his posture relaxed. "Start from the beginning," Jeremiah said. "Tell me what happened to my daughter." Catherine studied his face for a long moment before speaking. "Emma was taken, Mr. Pike. Not by strangers passing through, not by wild animals or accidents in the wilderness. She was taken by someone who knew your family, someone who had been planning it. The confirmation of his worst fears should have been devastating, but Jeremiah found that a part of him had always known. The complete lack of evidence, the way Emma had simply vanished without a trace, it had never felt like an accident, even when that's what he'd tried to convince himself. Who? The single word carried 30 years of rage and grief. A man named Thomas Brennan. He worked at the lumber mill outside Cedar Falls back then. Quiet man, kept to himself, but he'd been watching your family for months before he acted. Jeremiah searched his memory for the name, for any recollection of interaction with someone called Brennan. The lumber mill had been one of many businesses he'd visited regularly in his role as sheriff, checking on things, making sure workers felt comfortable reporting problems or concerns. But he couldn't place a face to the name Catherine had given him. Brennan had lost his own daughter years earlier, Catherine continued. She died of fever when she was Emma's age, and something in his mind snapped. He became convinced that your family had stolen his happiness, that he deserved to have what you had. So he took her. The words tasted like copper in Jeremiah's mouth. He took her, Catherine confirmed. But not to hurt her, at least not in the way you might think. In his twisted logic, he was rescuing her from a life he thought was meant to be his. He'd built a cabin deep in the wilderness, north of here, in country so remote that search parties never came close. The magnitude of it began settling over Jeremiah like a landslide. While he'd been searching every canyon and creek bed for signs of his daughter, she'd been alive, held captive by a madman who thought he was saving her. The searches that had consumed years of his life had been focused in entirely the wrong direction. "How do you know all this?" he asked. Catherine's hand moved unconsciously to a scar that ran along her jawline, mostly hidden by her hair. "Because Thomas Brennan was my father, and Emma Pike became my sister." The silence that followed Catherine's revelation stretched between them like a chasm. Jeremiah stared at this woman who claimed to be the daughter of his child's kidnapper, trying to reconcile the calm, intelligent person sitting across from him with the monster who had destroyed his family. "Your father," he said finally, the words carefully measured. "Where is he now?" "Dead. Died 8 years ago." Catherine's voice carried no emotion, as if she were discussing the weather. "Heart attack while he was splitting firewood. Emma and I buried him in the clearing behind his cabin." Jeremiah felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. Relief that the man who had taken Emma could never hurt anyone again, but also a bitter disappointment that justice would never be served. He'd imagined confronting his daughter's kidnapper countless times over the years, had fantasized about the moment when he'd look into the man's eyes and make him pay for what he'd done. "You said Emma's been looking for me," Jeremiah said. "If Brennan's been dead for 8 years, why didn't she come home then?" Catherine shifted in her chair, and for the first time since she'd appeared in his clearing, she looked uncomfortable. "That's where it gets complicated. You have to understand, Mr. Pike, by the time my father died, Emma had been with us for 22 years. She was 28 years old, not the 6-year-old girl who'd been taken from Willow Creek, but she was still my daughter. Yes, she was. But she was also terrified." Catherine leaned forward, her green eyes intense. "My father never physically harmed Emma, but he controlled every aspect of her life. He told her that you and her mother had stopped looking for her, that you'd given up and moved on. He said if she ever tried to leave, he'd kill you both." The casual cruelty of it took Jeremiah's breath away. Not only had Brennan stolen Emma's childhood, he'd poisoned her mind against the very people who had never stopped loving her. All those years of searching, of refusing to give up hope, and Emma had been told they'd abandoned her. She believed him? "She was 6 when he took her," Catherine said gently. "Children that age believe what adults tell them, especially when they're isolated from everyone else. My father was very good at making his lies sound like truth." Jeremiah pulled the doll from inside his jacket, holding Rebecca in his lap where Catherine could see her. The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she reached out instinctively before catching herself. "She's been looking for this," Catherine said softly. "Emma, I mean. She's been searching for Rebecca for 8 years, ever since father died, and she started remembering things more clearly." "Why here? Why this tree?" "Because this is where it started." Catherine's voice grew quiet, almost reverent. "The day my father took Emma, he brought her through this area on his way to the cabin. She was crying, clutching her doll and calling for you and her mother. When they stopped to rest, she threw Rebecca as hard as she could, hoping someone would find her and know she'd been here. The image of 6-year-old Emma, frightened and desperate, hurling her beloved doll into the wilderness as a message for her father, nearly broke what remained of Jeremiah's composure. She'd been trying to leave him a clue even then. If only he'd thought to search this far from Willow Creek, if only he'd expanded his search area instead of concentrating on the places that seemed most logical. The doll survived all these years in that tree. Catherine shook her head. "No, it decomposed long ago. But Emma remembered exactly where she'd thrown it. Last month, she came here and placed a new doll in the same spot. One she'd made herself, wrapped in a shawl she'd recreated from memory. She knew you still lived on this mountain. She'd been watching from a distance, learning your routines. The thought of Emma observing him without revealing herself added another layer of pain to an already overwhelming situation. How many times had she been close enough to call out to him? How many opportunities for reunion had passed while she wrestled with fear and uncertainty? "She's been watching me," Jeremiah said. It wasn't a question. For months. She knows about your morning walks, knows about Boone, knows you still live simply and alone. She wanted to approach you directly, but she was afraid I'd reject her. Jeremiah finished the thought, understanding finally why his daughter had chosen such an indirect method of contact. "She thought I blame her for not coming home sooner. Wouldn't you?" Catherine's question was direct, challenging. "Can you honestly say you wouldn't wonder why she waited 8 years after gaining her freedom to reach out? Why she let you suffer all this time believing she was dead?" Jeremiah considered the question seriously. Would he blame Emma? The honest answer was complicated. The father in him wanted nothing more than to hold his daughter again, to tell her that none of what had happened was her fault. But the man who had spent 30 years in agonizing uncertainty might indeed struggle with questions of why she'd waited so long to contact him. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'd like the chance to find out." Catherine smiled for the first time since her arrival, and in that expression, Jeremiah caught another glimpse of something familiar. Not just the resemblance he'd noticed earlier, but something in her manner that reminded him of Emma as a child, a particular way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. "There's more you need to know," Catherine said. "About what happened during those years, about how Emma survived, about why I chose to help her instead of my father. You weren't always on her side." Catherine's smile faded. "I was 4 when my father took Emma. To me, she wasn't a kidnapped child. She was the sister I'd always wanted. My father told me she was a gift from God, sent to replace the daughter he'd lost. I didn't understand what he'd really done until I was much older. When did you realize the truth?" "When I was 15 and Emma tried to run away. She made it almost to the main road before my father caught her and dragged her back. That night I heard them talking through the cabin walls. Emma was begging him to let her contact you, swearing she'd never tell anyone what had happened if he'd just let her send one letter to prove she was alive." Catherine paused, her hand moving again to the scar on her jaw. "My father beat her that night badly, and for the first time I understood that what he'd done wasn't a rescue, it was theft. Emma wasn't my sister by choice. She was my sister because she'd been stolen from people who loved her." The revelation that Catherine had been an unwitting accomplice before becoming an ally added another dimension to an already complex situation. She'd grown up believing Emma was meant to be part of their family, only to discover as a teenager that her entire childhood had been built on a crime. What happened after that night? "I started helping her plan, not to escape. My father watched us too closely for that, but to prepare for the day when we might be free. I taught her everything I could remember about the outside world, helped her practice driving when father was away, showed her how to survive in the wilderness if she ever got the chance to run. And when he died, Emma was paralyzed by fear and guilt. She'd spent so many years being told that you'd given up on her that she half believed it. Even with my father gone, she couldn't bring herself to simply walk down the mountain and knock on your door." Jeremiah looked down at Rebecca, understanding now why Emma had chosen such an elaborate method of re-establishing contact. The doll wasn't just a message, it was a test. If he found it and cared enough to investigate, it would prove that he still thought about her, still grieved for her. If he ignored it or dismissed it as meaningless, she'd have her answer about whether her father still wanted her in his life. "Where is she now?" he asked. Catherine pointed toward the northern ridgeline, where the peaks rose into country so remote that even the old maps marked it as largely unexplored. "About 12 miles that way, in a valley that doesn't have a name. She's waiting there, at the cabin where she grew up." Jeremiah followed her gaze, studying terrain he'd traversed many times during his searches but had never fully explored. The northern mountains were harsh country, accessible only by foot and only to those with serious wilderness skills. It made sense that Brennan would have chosen such an isolated location for his hideaway. "She's alone." "Yes, she wanted it that way. Said if you decided to come, it should be your choice." Not because you felt obligated or because she'd made it impossible to refuse. Catherine paused, then added quietly, "She's been alone for 8 years. Mr. Pike, alone with her memories and her fear that you might not want to see the woman she became." The idea of Emma living in isolation for 8 years, wrestling with questions about her father's love, struck Jeremiah as profoundly sad. While he'd been hiding from the world in his own mountain sanctuary, his daughter had been doing the same thing for entirely different reasons. Both of them had been prisoners of the same crime, separated by geography and misunderstanding. "Why didn't you approach me sooner?" Jeremiah asked. "Why wait for her to place the doll?" Catherine stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the valley where morning shadows were beginning to shorten. "Because I needed to be sure you were the man she remembered. Emma's memories of you are precious to her. They're what kept her sane during the worst times. If you'd become bitter or broken, if 30 years of grief had changed you into someone she wouldn't recognize, then approaching you might have been cruel. And what's your assessment?" There was a challenge in Jeremiah's voice, but also genuine curiosity. "You're harder than she remembers and sadder. But you're still the father who gave her that blue shawl for her birthday, who made faces behind her mother's shoulder to get her to smile for photographs. You're still the man worth loving." The simple declaration carried more weight than elaborate praise might have. Catherine had clearly thought carefully about this moment, had observed him long enough to form conclusions about his character. Her approval shouldn't have mattered. She was, after all, the daughter of the man who destroyed his family, but somehow it did. "There's something else you need to understand," Catherine continued. "Emma isn't the same person she would have been if she'd grown up with you and her mother. 30 years of isolation, of being controlled and manipulated, that changes a person. She's strong, probably stronger than you remember, but she's also guarded in ways that might surprise you." Jeremiah nodded, understanding the warning implicit in Catherine's words. He couldn't expect to pick up their relationship where it had been interrupted. Emma was no longer 6 years old, no longer the bright, chattering child who'd followed him around Cedar Falls. She was a 36-year-old woman who'd survived experiences he could barely imagine. What about her mother? The question had been weighing on him since Catherine's arrival. "Does Emma know that Sarah left?" Catherine's expression grew troubled. "She knows. My father made sure to tell her years later, when she was old enough to understand. He used it as proof that her family had moved on without her. Another layer of Brennan's cruelty revealed itself. Not content to simply separate Emma from her parents, he'd twisted the knife by ensuring she knew about the divorce, probably presenting it as evidence that the Pike family had been happy to forget her. "Sarah remarried," Jeremiah said quietly. "Lives in Denver now, has grown children from her second marriage. I haven't spoken to her in 20 years. Do you want Emma to know that?" Jeremiah considered the question. Part of him wanted to protect Emma from further pain, to let her maintain whatever illusions she might have about her mother's life. But another part recognized that 30 years of lies and manipulation had done enough damage. If Emma was going to rebuild her life, it needed to be based on truth, however difficult. "She deserves to know the truth about everything," he said finally. "All of it. What happened to her mother? What happened to me? Why I never stopped searching. She can decide for herself what to do with that information." Catherine nodded approvingly. "That's what I hoped you'd say. Emma's spent too many years living with half-truths and deliberate deceptions. She needs honesty, even when it hurts." A thought occurred to Jeremiah that made his stomach clench with anxiety. "What if she doesn't want to see me? What if she's changed her mind?" "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Catherine replied simply. "But I don't think that's likely. Do you know what she told me when she decided to place that doll in the tree?" Jeremiah shook his head. "She said she'd rather know for certain that you'd rejected her than spend the rest of her life wondering if you still loved her." That doesn't sound like someone who's planning to change her mind. The courage that decision must have required struck Jeremiah forcefully. After 30 years of captivity and 8 years of freedom paralyzed by uncertainty, Emma had finally chosen to risk everything on the chance that her father still cared. The doll in the hollow tree hadn't just been a message, it had been an act of profound bravery. "How do I find her?" he asked. Catherine reached into her jacket and withdrew a hand-drawn map, sketched on what looked like bark paper with charcoal. The route it showed was complex, following game trails and natural landmarks rather than any official paths. "It's a hard day's hike," she said, handing him the map. "The last 2 miles are particularly difficult. Steep country with loose rock and deadfall. But Emma knows these mountains as well as anyone alive. She'll be watching for you." Jeremiah studied the map, recognizing some of the landmarks Catherine had marked. The route would take him through country he'd searched during the early years after Emma's disappearance, but into areas he'd never fully explored. He could have passed within a mile of Brennan's cabin during those desperate expeditions and never known his daughter was so close. "When should I go?" "That's up to you. But if I were you, I wouldn't wait." Emma's been carrying this fear for 8 years. Every day she doesn't hear from you, she becomes a little more convinced that her worst assumptions are true. Jeremiah looked down at Rebecca, still cradled in his lap. The doll that had been thrown into the wilderness 30 years ago as a desperate plea for help had finally fulfilled its purpose. After 3 decades of silence, Emma had found a way to call to her father across the vast emptiness that had separated them. "I need to prepare for the journey," he said, standing from his chair. "Gather supplies, plan the route, Mr. Pike." Catherine's voice stopped him. "There's one more thing Emma wanted me to tell you. If you decided to come." Jeremiah turned back to face her, seeing something in her expression that made his chest tighten with anticipation. "She said to tell you that she still has the dress. The blue one her mother made for her 7th birthday. She's kept it all these years, even though it hasn't fit her since she was 12. She wanted you to know that she never forgot who she was, never forgot where she came from. The image of grown Emma carefully preserving a child's dress for 30 years, keeping it as a tangible link to the family she'd lost, completed the destruction of Jeremiah's emotional defenses. He sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the magnitude of love and loyalty that gesture represented. "I'll leave at first light," he said, when he could trust his voice again. "Will you come with me?" Catherine shook her head. "This is between you and Emma. I've done what I came to do." She paused, then added, "But I'll be around if either of you needs anything. I've a place about 5 miles south of here, close enough to help, but far enough away to give you privacy." She stood to leave, then turned back one final time. "Mr. Pike, Emma's going to be nervous when you arrive. Probably terrified, actually. She's been imagining this reunion for 8 years, and reality never matches our fantasies. Just be patient with her, and with yourself." With that advice hanging in the mountain air, Catherine Mills walked back into the forest, leaving Jeremiah alone with his dog, his memories, and the profound knowledge that his daughter was alive. Jeremiah spent the rest of that day in a state of focused preparation that reminded him of his years as a lawman. He checked and rechecked his gear, studying Catherine's map until he could have drawn it from memory. His hands moved through familiar motions, organizing supplies, testing equipment, planning for contingencies, but his mind remained fixed on the impossibility of what awaited him. Emma was alive. After 30 years of believing otherwise, after building an entire identity around loss and grief, the fundamental truth of his existence had shifted beneath his feet like loose shale on a mountain slope. The daughter he'd mourned was not only breathing, but had been thinking of him, planning to contact him, preserving memories of their life together. As evening approached, Jeremiah found himself holding Rebecca again, studying the careful craftsmanship that had gone into recreating his daughter's childhood companion. Emma had sewn this doll by hand, probably working by lamplight in the isolated cabin where she'd spent most of her adult life. Every stitch represented an act of remembrance, a deliberate choice to honor the past rather than let it fade. The blue shawl was particularly remarkable in its accuracy. Emma had somehow managed to match not just the color, but the texture and weight of the original wool. She must have carried the memory of that fabric in her fingers for 30 years, storing the tactile sensation alongside visual recollections of birthdays and bedtime stories. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams that were both blessing and torment. Jeremiah found himself reliving moments from Emma's childhood with startling clarity, teaching her to fish in the creek behind their house, braiding wildflowers into her hair during picnics in the meadow, reading bedtime stories by the light of her bedroom lamp. But the dreams carried an undertone of loss, a persistent awareness that the child in his memories had grown into a woman he'd never met. He woke before dawn, as had been his habit for 20 years, but this morning carried a weight of purpose that had been absent from his mountain routine. Boone sensed the change immediately, following his master with unusual attentiveness as Jeremiah performed his final preparations. The question of whether to bring the dog had occupied much of his thinking the previous evening. Boone was old now, his joints stiff and his stamina limited. The journey Catherine had described would be challenging even for a man in good condition, potentially dangerous for an aging hound. But the alternative, leaving his faithful companion behind, felt like abandonment of the worst kind. In the end, Jeremiah decided that Boone had earned the right to make his own choice. If the dog couldn't keep pace, they'd rest. If the terrain proved too difficult, they'd find another way. After 8 years of waiting, a few extra hours wouldn't matter to Emma. They set out as the first pale light touched the eastern peaks, following game trails that wound through stands of ponderosa pine and aspen. Catherine's map proved accurate in its details, leading them past landmarks that would have been invisible to casual hikers, but stood out clearly to those who knew how to read the mountain's subtle language. The early miles passed in comfortable silence, with Boone maintaining a steady trot despite his years. Jeremiah found his thoughts drifting between anticipation and apprehension, cycling through imagined scenarios of his reunion with Emma. Would she run to him as she had when he'd returned from work each evening? Would she be reserved, uncertain how to relate to a father she remembered as a giant, but now met as an equal? Would the years of separation prove too wide a chasm to bridge? By mid-morning, they'd reached the first significant landmark on Catherine's map, a distinctive rock formation that locals called Eagle's Perch. From this vantage point, Jeremiah could see the route ahead winding through increasingly rugged terrain. The comfort of familiar trails was giving way to true wilderness. Country where a wrong turn could mean hours of difficult backtracking. It was here that Jeremiah first began to understand the full scope of Emma's isolation. The path ahead led into mountains that were genuinely remote, accessible only to those with serious outdoor skills and the determination to push beyond the boundaries of normal human habitation. Brennan had chosen his hiding place well, a location so far from civilization that even dedicated searchers were unlikely to stumble across it. The realization brought a fresh wave of anger at the man who'd stolen his daughter. Not only had Brennan taken Emma from her family, he'd deliberately placed her beyond the reach of rescue, even if she'd managed to escape during her early years of captivity. The journey back to civilization would have been daunting for a grown man, potentially fatal for a child. As they climbed higher, Boone began showing signs of fatigue. His tongue lolled from his mouth despite the cool mountain air, and his pace had slowed to a determined trudge. Jeremiah called for a rest at a small meadow where a spring provided fresh water for both man and dog. While Boone rested in the shade of a fallen log, Jeremiah studied the next section of Catherine's map. The route ahead looked particularly challenging, a steep ascent followed by a traverse across loose scree that would require careful footwork. He estimated another 4 hours of hiking, assuming they encountered no serious obstacles. "Getting too old for this, aren't we, boy?" Jeremiah said, scratching behind Boone's ears. The dog's tail thumped against the ground, but his eyes held a weariness that spoke of age and accumulated miles. As they prepared to continue, Jeremiah found himself thinking about the years that had passed since Emma's disappearance. He'd aged from a man in his prime to someone approaching the end of his seventh decade. His hair had gone from brown to grey to white. His face had accumulated lines that spoke of weather and worry. And his body carried the accumulated aches of 2 decades in the mountains. What would Emma see when she looked at him? Would she recognize the father she remembered? Or would he appear as a stranger wearing her father's clothes? The uncertainty was almost as difficult to bear as the years of not knowing whether she was alive. The afternoon brought them to the base of the final ascent, where Catherine's map showed the steepest portion of the journey. Looking up at the rocky slope that stretched toward the ridgeline, Jeremiah understood why Emma had remained hidden for so long. This was country that discouraged casual exploration, terrain that turned back all but the most determined travelers. Boone studied the path ahead with obvious reluctance, his breathing still labored from their morning's exertion. Jeremiah knelt beside his companion, making a decision that felt both practical and symbolic. "You've come far enough, old friend," he said quietly. "This last part, I need to do it alone." He found a sheltered spot beneath an overhang where Boone would be protected from weather and wind. After setting out water and the last of his dried meat, Jeremiah gave the dog a final pat and shouldered his reduced pack. Boone watched him go with eyes that seemed to understand the significance of this separation. The climb up the rocky slope tested every muscle in Jeremiah's aging body. The loose stones shifted underfoot with each step, and the thin air at altitude made every breath a conscious effort. But with each vertical foot gained, he felt closer to a reunion that had been 30 years in the making. Near the top of the ridge, Jeremiah paused to catch his breath and study Catherine's map one final time. According to her notations, Emma's valley lay just beyond the next rise. After 3 decades of searching, he was perhaps an hour away from seeing his daughter again. The knowledge filled him with a mixture of joy and terror, unlike anything he'd experienced since the day she'd disappeared. In his pocket, Rebecca waited patiently, ready to complete the journey that had begun when a frightened 6-year-old had thrown her predecessor into the wilderness as a desperate call for help. Jeremiah folded the map, straightened his pack, and began the final approach to a reunion he'd dreamed of for half his lifetime. The valley that opened before Jeremiah was nothing like what he'd expected. Instead of the primitive hideaway he'd imagined, he found himself looking down at what could only be described as a small homestead. A well-built log cabin sat at the valley's center, surrounded by carefully tended gardens, a chicken coop, and what appeared to be a workshop or barn. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, and he could see the geometric patterns of cultivated fields stretching toward the valley's far end. This wasn't the ramshackle prison of a madman. This was a home, carefully maintained, thoughtfully designed, and obviously lived in by someone who took pride in their surroundings. The contradiction between what he'd expected and what he saw left Jeremiah momentarily disoriented. Movement near the cabin caught his attention. A figure emerged from the workshop, too distant to make out clearly but unmistakably human. Even at this distance, something about the person's posture and gait struck him as familiar, though he couldn't quite place why. The figure paused, seeming to look up toward the ridge where he stood, then disappeared back into the building. Jeremiah began his descent into the valley, following a well-worn path that spoke of regular use. As he drew closer to the homestead, details became clearer. The gardens were meticulously organized, with neat rows of vegetables and herbs that suggested serious agricultural knowledge. The chicken coop was built with obvious skill, its design both functional and aesthetically pleasing, but it was the workshop that gave him the first real surprise. Through its open doors, he could see equipment that seemed far too sophisticated for such a remote location, what looked like a potter's wheel. Shelves lined with finished ceramics and tools that suggested metalworking capabilities. This wasn't just a survival outpost. It was the workspace of someone with refined skills and artistic sensibilities. The cabin's front door opened as Jeremiah reached the edge of the cleared area, and a woman stepped onto the porch. She was tall and graceful, with dark hair streaked with early grey and eyes that were unmistakably familiar. "But she wasn't Emma, Mr. Pike," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Jeremiah stopped walking, confusion and disappointment warring in his chest. This woman was perhaps 10 years younger than Emma should be, and while there was something about her features that seemed familiar, she was clearly not his daughter. "I'm looking for Emma Pike," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and bewilderment. "Catherine Mills told me she lived here." The woman smiled, and in that expression Jeremiah caught a glimpse of something that made his heart skip. It was Emma's smile, not exactly, but close enough to be unmistakable to someone who'd spent 6 years memorizing his daughter's every expression. "Emma Pike hasn't lived anywhere for 30 years, the woman said gently. "But Emma Brennan has been waiting here to meet you." The statement hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. Emma Brennan, his daughter, had taken her captor's name, had identified herself with the man who'd stolen her from her family. The knowledge was devastating in ways he hadn't anticipated. "She chose that name," the woman continued, as if reading his thoughts. "When she was old enough to understand what had happened to her, she decided that Emma Pike had died the day she was taken. Emma Brennan was the person who survived. And you are?" "I'm Mary Brennan, Emma's daughter." The world tilted sideways. Jeremiah gripped the porch railing for support, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. Emma had a daughter. His daughter had a child, which meant he had a granddaughter standing before him, a granddaughter who carried the name of his family's destroyer. "Emma's inside," Mary continued, her voice gentle but steady. "She's been preparing for this moment for weeks, but now that you're here, she's terrified. She asked me to speak with you first, to explain some things before you see her." Jeremiah nodded numbly, not trusting his voice. The reunion he'd imagined for 30 years was becoming something far more complex than he'd ever anticipated. Not only was his daughter a stranger, but she was a mother, and her child was old enough to speak for her in difficult conversations. "How old are you?" he managed to ask. 25, Mary replied. "I know that raises questions you're probably not ready to hear answered." The implication was clear, and it added another layer of horror to an already overwhelming situation. Emma had been perhaps 11 when this child was conceived, still essentially the little girl who'd been taken from Willow Creek, but old enough for Thomas Brennan's abuse to take its most evil form. "My father wasn't a monster in the way you're thinking," Mary said quietly, again seeming to read his thoughts. "He was sick, yes, and what he did was wrong, but he never—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I wasn't born from violence, Mr. Pike. I was born from a kind of twisted love that developed over years of isolation." The distinction she was making was important. Jeremiah realized, though it didn't lessen the fundamental wrongness of the situation. Emma had been a child when Brennan took her, and regardless of what she might have felt or believed as she grew older, the relationship that had produced this granddaughter had been built on a foundation of kidnapping and psychological manipulation. "Does she remember me?" he asked. Mary's expression softened. "She remembers everything. Every birthday, every bedtime story, every moment of her life before. She's kept all of it alive in her mind for 30 years. But she's also afraid that her memories are better than reality, that the father she worships might be disappointed by the woman she became. Could I be?" The question escaped before Jeremiah could stop it. "That's what she's afraid of," Mary admitted. "She's not the little girl you lost, grandfather. She's a woman who's done whatever she had to do to survive, who's made choices you might not understand or approve of. She's loved a man who stole her from you, and she's raised a daughter to see that man as a hero, despite his crimes." The honesty was brutal but necessary. Mary was preparing him for realities he hadn't considered, warning him that his reunion with Emma would require accepting truths that might challenge everything he believed about family, love and loyalty. "Where is she now?" "In the cabin, trying to decide whether to run or face you." Mary stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. She's been rehearsing what she wants to say for 8 years, but she's convinced that when she opens her mouth, only apologies will come out. Jeremiah looked toward the cabin's windows, where he could see the warm glow of lamplight despite the afternoon sun. Somewhere beyond that door, the daughter he'd mourned for 30 years was wrestling with her own fears and uncertainties about this reunion. "Before you go in," Mary said, "there's something else you need to understand. My mother loved Thomas Brennan. Not at first, that would have been impossible. But as she grew older, she came to see him as the only family she had left. His death broke her heart, even knowing what he'd done was wrong, another hard truth to accept. Emma hadn't just survived her captivity. She'd found ways to make it meaningful, to build love and purpose within the confines of an impossible situation. The man Jeremiah saw as a monster had been to Emma a father figure and eventually something more. "She named me Mary after your mother," his granddaughter continued. "The grandmother I never met but heard about in bedtime stories. She wanted to keep that connection alive, even when she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to share it with you." This small gesture of remembrance, naming her daughter after his own mother, gave Jeremiah hope that, despite everything that had happened, Emma had never completely let go of her original family. Even in the depths of her isolation, she'd found ways to honor the past while building a future. "Is she ready to see me?" Mary smiled again, and this time Jeremiah could see not just Emma in her features, but traces of his own family line. The strong jaw that had been his mother's trademark, the direct gaze that had marked Pike men for generations. "She's as ready as someone can be for the impossible," Mary said. "The question is whether you're ready to see her." Jeremiah pulled Rebecca from his jacket, holding the doll where Mary could see it. His granddaughter's eyes widened, and she reached out instinctively before catching herself. "She made this for me to find," he said. "After 30 years, she found a way to call me home. I think that means we're both as ready as we'll ever be." Mary nodded and opened the cabin door, revealing a warm interior lit by oil lamps and heated by a wood-burning stove. And there, silhouetted against the golden light, stood a woman who was unmistakably his daughter. Older, changed, but still recognizably the child he'd lost so long ago. Emma turned toward the door, her green eyes meeting his across 30 years of separation. And Jeremiah Pike finally understood that some miracles are worth waiting a lifetime to receive. For a moment that stretched like eternity, father and daughter simply stared at each other across the threshold of the cabin. Emma stood frozen in the lamplight, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, while Jeremiah remained on the porch, Rebecca clutched against his chest like a talisman. The weight of 30 years pressed down on them both, making even breathing feel difficult. Emma had grown into a beautiful woman, though not in the conventional way. Her face showed the marks of hard living and mountain weather, with lines around her eyes that spoke of squinting against snow glare and wind. Her dark hair, so much like her mother's, was pulled back in a practical braid, but silver threads caught the lamplight. She was tall and strong-looking, with the kind of lean muscle that came from years of physical work. But it was her eyes that held Jeremiah captive, green eyes that were unmistakably the same ones that had looked up at him with complete trust when she was 6 years old. They held wariness now and fear, but underneath those defensive emotions, he could see the spark of intelligence and determination that had marked his daughter even as a child. "Hello, Papa," Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The word Papa hit Jeremiah with devastating force. It was what she'd called him as a little girl, pronounced with the careful precision of someone learning to speak properly. Hearing it now from the lips of a grown woman nearly destroyed what remained of his composure. Emma. He spoke her name like a prayer, like something sacred that needed to be handled with infinite care. Mary stepped quietly past them both, disappearing into what looked like a kitchen area, giving them the space they needed for this moment. Her presence lingered, though, a reminder that this reunion was more complicated than either father or daughter had imagined it would be. "You look old," Emma said, and then immediately flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "I am old," Jeremiah replied gently. 30 years older than the last time you saw me. You look—" He struggled for words that could encompass the magnitude of what he was seeing. "You look like your mother." Emma's face crumpled slightly at the mention of Sarah. "Catherine told me she left. Told me she remarried and has other children now." "Yes," Jeremiah confirmed, wishing he could soften the truth somehow. "She tried to wait, tried to heal, but I couldn't let go of looking for you. It drove us apart. I'm sorry." The words came out in a rush, heavy with guilt that had been festering for years. "I'm sorry she lost her family because of me. Sorry you spent your life searching for someone who was never coming home. Emma—" "No." Jeremiah stepped forward instinctively, then stopped himself when he saw her tense. "You have nothing to apologize for. You were 6 years old. None of what happened was your fault. But what happened after—" Emma's voice broke slightly. "What I became, the choices I made, the life I built here, that was my fault." Jeremiah looked around the cabin's interior, taking in details he'd missed during his initial shock. The space was comfortable and well organized, with handmade furniture that showed real craftsmanship. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with what looked like hundreds of volumes. Paintings hung on the walls, landscapes that captured the mountain's beauty with an artist's eye. This wasn't the primitive shelter he'd expected to find. This was a home built with love and care. "Tell me about your life," he said, settling carefully into a chair that Emma indicated. "Tell me about the 30 years I missed." Emma perched on the edge of another chair, maintaining distance but no longer looking ready to flee. "I don't know where to start." "Start with what you remember about that day at Willow Creek." Emma closed her eyes. And for a moment, Jeremiah could see the 6-year-old she'd been, small and vulnerable and trying to be brave. "I remember picking berries with Mama. I remember she was wearing her blue dress, the one with tiny flowers on it. I was playing with Rebecca, setting up a tea party on that old log." She opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "I remember a man coming out of the trees. He was crying, talking about his little girl who died, saying that I looked just like her. He said my parents had sent him to bring me home, that there was an emergency." The casual cruelty of the lie made Jeremiah's hands clench into fists. Brennan had used a child's trust and natural desire to help to manipulate her into coming with him willingly. "I believed him," Emma continued. "He seemed so sad, and he knew my name, knew things about our family. When I started to get scared and asked for Rebecca, he said we'd come back for her later. So I threw her into the woods, hoping someone would find her and know I'd been there." "That was very smart," Jeremiah said quietly. "That was exactly the right thing to do." Emma's smile was small but genuine. "You always told me to leave signs if I ever got lost." I remembered what happened then. He carried me deeper into the mountains than I'd ever been. When I got tired and started crying for you and Mama, he told me that you'd been in an accident, that you might not live. He said he was taking me somewhere safe until you got better. The elaborateness of Brennan's deception became clearer with each detail Emma shared. He hadn't simply kidnapped a child. He'd constructed an entire false reality designed to make her grateful for his protection. "How long before you realized he was lying?" "Years," Emma admitted, shame coloring her voice. "He was very good at making the lies sound reasonable. When I asked why we couldn't visit you in the hospital, he said the doctors wouldn't allow children. When I asked why we couldn't at least send letters, he said you were too sick to read them, but you eventually figured it out. When I was about 12, I started asking questions he couldn't answer well. Why hadn't any other family members come to check on me? Why didn't we ever go to town for supplies? Why couldn't I go to school with other children?" Emma stood and walked to the window, looking out at the valley she'd called home for so long. "That's when he told me the truth, or at least his version of it. He said he'd taken me because God had told him to, because his own daughter had died, and he deserved to have a family again. He said you and Mama had stopped looking for me after a few months, that you'd had another baby and forgotten about me." The final lie was perhaps the cruelest of all. Not only had Brennan stolen Emma's childhood, he'd poisoned her memories of her parents' love by convincing her they'd replaced her. He was lying about that too, Jeremiah said firmly. I never stopped looking. Not for a single day in 30 years. Emma turned back to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. I know that now. Catherine told me about your searches, about how you gave up everything else to keep looking. But for so long I believed him. What changed? Mary. Emma's voice grew stronger when she spoke her daughter's name. When I had Mary, I understood for the first time what real love between a parent and child felt like. I realized that no parent who truly loved their child would ever stop looking, never stop hoping. That's when I knew Thomas had been lying about you and Mama. The mention of Mary brought up questions Jeremiah wasn't sure he was ready to ask. His granddaughter was 25, which meant Emma had been perhaps 11 when she was conceived. The math was horrifying, regardless of how Emma had come to view her relationship with Brennan. You loved him, Jeremiah said carefully. It wasn't a question, Emma nodded, not looking away from his eyes. I loved him because he was all I had. He was my whole world for 22 years, Papa. He fed me, taught me to read, protected me from things that scared me. When you're that isolated, that dependent on someone, love becomes a survival mechanism. And Mary's father. Thomas, Emma confirmed quietly. I know how that sounds to you. I know what you're thinking about the age I was, about the wrongness of it. But by the time Mary was conceived, I was 18, and I thought he was my husband. He'd convinced me we were married in the eyes of God, that our isolation made normal ceremonies unnecessary. Jeremiah struggled to process this information without judgment, but it was perhaps the most difficult thing Emma had shared. The idea of his daughter being manipulated into such a relationship, even as an older teenager, filled him with rage that had nowhere to go. I need you to understand something, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. Thomas never forced himself on me, never hurt me physically in any way. What he did was worse. He made me believe that loving him was my choice, my idea. He was very good at psychological manipulation. But you did love him. Yes, Emma said simply. Wrong as it was, twisted as the foundation was, I did love him. And when he died, I grieved for him. That's something I need you to accept if we're going to have any kind of relationship. The honesty was brutal, but necessary. Emma was laying out the terms of their reunion, making it clear that she wouldn't apologize for the life she'd built or the feelings she'd developed during her captivity. She was asking him to accept her as she was, not as he might wish she'd become. Can you do that? She asked. Can you love a daughter who loved her kidnapper? Jeremiah looked at this woman who was unmistakably his child, who carried his blood and his mother's name in her memory, who had found ways to survive and even thrive in circumstances that should have destroyed her. She was asking him to love not just the 6-year-old he'd lost, but the complex, damaged, resilient woman she'd become. Yes, he said finally. I can do that. Emma's face crumpled with relief, and for the first time since he'd entered the cabin, she moved toward him. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and touched the doll he still held in his hands. You kept her safe, Emma whispered, her fingers tracing Rebecca's faded features. Just like I should have kept you safe, Jeremiah replied, his own voice breaking. You tried. Papa, you tried for 30 years, and then, finally, impossibly, his daughter was in his arms. Not the small child he remembered, but the strong woman she'd become, holding him with a fierceness that spoke of decades of longing finally satisfied. They held each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, both of them crying, with the raw emotion of a reunion 30 years in the making. Emma felt solid and real in Jeremiah's arms, not the ghost he'd been chasing through the mountains all these years, but a living, breathing woman who smelled of pine, soap, and wood smoke, and carried the warmth of someone who had learned to build a life from nothing. When they finally separated, Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar from her childhood that it made Jeremiah's heart ache. She'd done the same thing after falling and scraping her knee, after crying over a broken toy, after any of the small tragedies that had seemed enormous to a 6-year-old mind. I have something for you, Emma said, her voice still thick with emotion. She disappeared into what appeared to be a bedroom, returning a moment later with a bundle of blue fabric. "I kept it all these years, even though it stopped fitting me when I was 12. She unfolded the dress carefully, revealing the same blue garment she'd worn for her 7th birthday party, the one Sarah had sewn with such care, decorating it with tiny pearl buttons and delicate embroidery around the collar. The fabric had faded somewhat, and there were careful repairs where it had been mended over the years. But it was unmistakably the same dress. I used to put it on when I was scared," Emma explained, smoothing the fabric with gentle hands. "When Thomas told me you'd forgotten about me, I'd wear this dress and remember the birthday party. Remember how proud you looked when Mama brought me downstairs wearing it for the first time." Jeremiah touched the dress with trembling fingers, remembering Sarah bent over her sewing machine night after night, determined to create something special for their daughter's birthday. The dress had been Sarah's way of showing love, practical, beautiful, made to last. "She would want you to have this back," he said quietly. "No," Emma shook her head firmly. "This dress belongs here now. It's part of the life I built, part of the memories that kept me sane during the hardest times. But I wanted you to see that I never forgot where I came from." Mary emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray with 3 cups of coffee and what looked like fresh bread. She'd obviously been giving them privacy for their reunion, but now seemed to sense that they were ready for her presence. She set the tray on a small table and took a seat across from them, studying her grandfather with open curiosity. "You look like the photographs," Mary said simply. "Mama has pictures of you from when she was little. She used to show them to me when I was growing up, tell me stories about my grandfather who lived down in the valley. She told you about me." "Everything she could remember," Mary confirmed. "How you taught her to fish, how you used to read her stories before bed, how you made faces behind Mama Sarah's shoulder to make her laugh for pictures. She made sure I knew that I had family beyond this valley, even if we couldn't contact them." The knowledge that Emma had kept his memory alive for her daughter was both comforting and heartbreaking. Mary had grown up knowing about grandparents she'd never met, about a larger family that existed somewhere beyond the mountains. It must have been a special kind of torture for a child, knowing about connections she couldn't explore. "What did you tell her about why we weren't in contact?" Jeremiah asked Emma. "The truth as much as I understood it," Emma replied. "That Thomas had taken me when I was little, that my original family thought I was dead, that the situation was too complicated for simple solutions. I never wanted her to grow up with the lies I'd believed." Mary leaned forward slightly, her green eyes, so like Emma's, fixed on Jeremiah's face. "I've wanted to meet you my entire life," she said. "But I was also afraid of what it would mean. If you couldn't accept Mama's life here, couldn't accept the choices she made, then what would that mean for me?" The question was more perceptive than Jeremiah had expected from someone so young. But then he realized that Mary had probably been thinking about these complications for years. She was the product of a relationship that most people would consider wrong, raised in isolation by a mother who carried the trauma of kidnapping and manipulation. Of course she would worry about acceptance and judgment. "You're my granddaughter," Jeremiah said firmly. "Nothing changes that. Nothing makes it less true or less important." Mary's smile was radiant, transforming her face in a way that made her resemblance to Emma even more pronounced. "Good," she said simply, "because I plan to be part of your life now, whether you like it or not." The easy confidence in her declaration reminded Jeremiah of Emma as a child. The same determination, the same assumption that love conquered obstacles. It was remarkable how certain traits seemed to pass down through generations, surviving even the most unlikely circumstances. "Tell me about this place," Jeremiah said, gesturing around the cabin. "How did you build all this?" Emma's expression grew more animated as she described the years of work that had gone into creating their mountain homestead. Thomas had been a skilled craftsman, she explained, and he taught both her and Mary to work with wood and stone. The cabin had been expanded several times as their needs grew, always with an eye toward both function and beauty. "The workshop is where I make pottery," Emma continued, pride evident in her voice. "Mary does metalwork, jewelry mostly, but also practical things like tools and hardware. We trade our work in town for supplies we can't make ourselves." "You go to town?" Jeremiah was surprised. He'd assumed they lived in complete isolation. "Twice a year," Mary explained. "We take our goods to a trading post about 20 miles south of here. The man who runs it doesn't ask questions about where we come from or why we live so far out. He just cares that our work is good quality." The picture they painted was of a life that was isolated but not entirely cut off from the world. They'd found ways to be self-sufficient while still maintaining minimal contact with civilization. It was a delicate balance that spoke to careful planning and considerable skill. "I'd like to see your work," Jeremiah said. Emma's face lit up. "Really? You're not just being polite?" "I'm never just polite," he replied, earning a laugh from both women, a sound that filled the cabin with warmth and lightness. They spent the next hour touring the homestead, with Emma and Mary proudly showing off their various projects and accomplishments. The pottery in Emma's workshop was genuinely beautiful, functional pieces with artistic flourishes that spoke to real talent. Mary's metalwork was equally impressive. Delicate jewelry, alongside sturdy tools that showed mastery of a difficult craft. But it was the gardens that truly amazed Jeremiah. They'd somehow managed to create productive growing space in a mountain valley where the growing season was brutally short. Root cellars and preserved foods suggested they were completely self-sufficient in terms of nutrition. "Thomas taught us most of this," Emma explained as they walked between the rows of vegetables. "He was determined that we'd never have to depend on the outside world for survival." The mention of Brennan's name still created a complicated mix of emotions for Jeremiah. He could see evidence everywhere of the man's skills and knowledge, the well-built structures, the productive gardens, the careful planning that had made this isolated life possible. It was impossible to deny that Brennan had provided well for Emma and Mary, even as Jeremiah struggled with the fundamental wrongness of the situation that had brought them here. As the afternoon wore on, Jeremiah found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't experienced in decades. Watching Emma and Mary together, seeing the easy affection between them, observing the life they'd built in this hidden valley, it was impossible not to recognize that despite its dark origins, something good had grown here. But as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, reality intruded on their reunion. Jeremiah thought about Boone, waiting patiently where he'd left him on the ridge. He thought about his own cabin, dark and empty for the first time in years. Most importantly, he thought about what came next. "I should head back," he said reluctantly. "I left Boone on the ridge, and it's going to be a hard journey down in the dark." Emma's face fell. "You're leaving? Already?" "I have to. But I'll come back. Now that I know where you are, now that I know you're alive." He stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what this day had brought into his life. "Stay," Mary said suddenly. "Stay the night. There's plenty of room, and you shouldn't be traveling these mountains after dark. You can go get your dog tomorrow. Bring him back here." The invitation hung in the mountain air, offering something Jeremiah had thought lost forever. The chance to wake up in the same place as his family, to share meals and conversations, and the simple pleasure of not being alone. "If you're sure it's not an imposition," he said. "Papa," Emma said, using his childhood name again. "You could never be an imposition. This is your family's home now, too." That evening, sitting around the cabin's handmade dining table, Jeremiah experienced something he'd thought lost forever, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with family. Emma had prepared venison stew with vegetables from their garden, and Mary had baked bread in the wood-fired oven that dominated one corner of the kitchen. The food was simple but perfectly prepared, seasoned with herbs they'd grown and preserved themselves. "This is how we eat every night," Emma said, noticing Jeremiah's appreciation of the meal. "Thomas insisted we maintain proper customs, even in isolation." Set the table properly, say grace, discuss our day. He said civilization wasn't about where you lived, but how you chose to live. It was another complicated legacy of the man who'd stolen his daughter, this insistence on maintaining dignity and routine even in the wilderness. Jeremiah found himself grudgingly respecting aspects of how Brennan had raised Emma, even while despising the fundamental crime that had made it necessary. "Tell me about your mother," Mary said suddenly, looking directly at Jeremiah. "Mama Sarah. I've heard stories, but I'd like to know what she was really like." Jeremiah set down his spoon, unprepared for the flood of memories the question triggered. "She was the smartest person I ever knew," he said finally. Smarter than the school teacher job suggested. She could have been anything, a doctor, a lawyer, a writer, but she chose to stay in Cedar Falls and teach children because she believed education could change lives. Emma listened intently, hungry for details about the mother she'd barely known. What did she look like when she smiled? "Like sunshine breaking through storm clouds," Jeremiah replied without hesitation. "When your mother smiled, really smiled, it changed the whole room. Made everyone else want to smile too. Do I look like her?" Jeremiah studied his daughter's face in the lamplight, seeing both familiar and foreign elements in her features. "You have her bone structure, her way of tilting her head when you're thinking, but you've got my stubborn jaw and your grandmother Pike's green eyes." "Tell me about my grandmother," Mary requested. "The one I'm named for. Mary Pike was the strongest woman who ever lived," Jeremiah began, settling into the rhythm of family storytelling. "She came west in a wagon train when she was 16, married my father when she was 18, and raised 5 children in a one-room cabin while he was away mining for gold. She could shoot better than most men, doctor injuries that would have killed lesser folks, and make a meal out of ingredients that would stump a trained cook." As he spoke, Jeremiah watched his granddaughter's face light up with interest and pride. She was learning about her heritage, discovering the line of strong women she descended from. It occurred to him that Mary had grown up knowing only half her story, the Brennan side that had shaped her daily life, but not the Pike legacy that lived in her blood. "She sounds formidable," Mary said. "She was, but she was also kind, especially to children who needed help. She took in orphans, fed anyone who showed up hungry at her door, and never turned away someone in need. Emma, you used to love the stories I told about her. I remember some of them," Emma said softly. "The one about how she scared off a bear with nothing but a wooden spoon and a fierce expression. That's the one." Jeremiah smiled at the memory of 6-year-old Emma's wide-eyed fascination with her grandmother's adventures. "She said the bear took one look at her face and decided he'd rather find dinner somewhere else." Mary laughed, a sound that filled the cabin with warmth. "I like thinking I'm named after someone so brave." "You are brave," Jeremiah told her. "Both of you are. What you've built here, the way you've survived and thrived despite everything, that takes the kind of courage your great-grandmother would have recognized and respected." As the evening progressed, they shared more stories, Emma describing the challenges of learning to live off the land, Mary talking about her experiments with different metalworking techniques, Jeremiah recounting some of his less painful memories from the search years. Gradually, the conversation became easier, more natural, as if they were picking up threads of connection that had been interrupted but never truly broken. When full darkness fell outside the cabin windows, Mary excused herself to prepare a sleeping area for Jeremiah in the main room. Emma helped him settle in, providing extra blankets and making sure he had everything he needed for the night. "Papa," she said quietly, as they arranged his bedding near the fireplace, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. All right. Do you think you can forgive me? Not just for surviving, but for the choices I made while I was surviving." Jeremiah stopped what he was doing and looked directly at his daughter. "Emma, there's nothing to forgive. You were a child when this started, and everything that happened after was about finding ways to stay alive and sane in an impossible situation. But I loved him," she whispered. "Even knowing what he'd done was wrong, even understanding that he'd stolen me from you, I still loved him. and part of me misses him even now." The confession hung between them, heavy with shame and confusion. Emma was asking him to accept not just that she'd survived her captivity, but that she'd found ways to make it meaningful, even sacred in its own twisted way. "Love isn't always logical," Jeremiah said carefully. "Sometimes we love people who hurt us, or who make choices we can't understand. That doesn't make the love wrong, it just makes it human." "You really believe that?" "I believe that you did what you had to do to survive, and that includes finding ways to love and be loved, even in the worst circumstances. I believe that Thomas Brennan, whatever his crimes, gave you Mary, and Mary is one of the greatest gifts I've ever received." Emma's eyes filled with tears again. But these seemed different from the earlier ones, tears of relief rather than fear. "I spent 8 years afraid you'd hate me for not being the daughter you remembered," she said. "And I spent 30 years afraid I'd failed you as a father," Jeremiah replied. "Maybe it's time we both stopped being afraid of things that were never true." Emma kissed his forehead, a gesture that transported him instantly back to bedtime rituals from decades past. "Sleep well, Papa. Tomorrow we'll go get Boone and bring him home." After she'd gone to her room, Jeremiah lay on the comfortable bedding, staring up at the cabin's rafters. For the first time in 30 years, he wasn't alone. Somewhere beyond the wooden walls, his daughter and granddaughter were sleeping peacefully, safe and whole and part of his life again. The doll Rebecca sat on the table beside his makeshift bed, her button eye catching reflections from the dying fire. She completed her mission at last, carried a message across 30 years of separation, and brought a family back together. Tomorrow, Jeremiah would retrieve Boone and begin figuring out how to integrate this new reality into his life. But tonight, for the first time since October of 1993, he fell asleep knowing that his daughter was alive and safe. Outside the cabin, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. Winter was coming, as it always did in this country, but inside the warm cabin, 3 generations of family slept peacefully, finally reunited after decades of separation and loss. Jeremiah woke to the sound of quiet conversation and the smell of coffee brewing. Through the cabin's windows, he could see that dawn was still an hour away, but Emma and Mary were already up, moving efficiently through their morning routine. He lay still for a moment, savoring the unfamiliar pleasure of waking up to the sounds of family life. "Good morning, Papa," Emma said softly when she noticed he was awake. "I hope we didn't disturb you." "Best sleep I've had in 20 years, he replied honestly, sitting up and stretching muscles that felt more rested than they had in recent memory. Mary appeared with a cup of coffee, prepared exactly the way he preferred it, strong and black, the way mountain folk learned to drink it when supplies were precious. The fact that she'd somehow intuited his preferences spoke to an attentiveness that reminded him of Emma as a child. "We should leave early if we're going to retrieve your dog and get back before the weather changes," Emma said, glancing toward the windows where grey clouds were gathering over the peaks. Jeremiah nodded, recognizing the signs of an approaching mountain storm. In country this remote, being caught in bad weather could be dangerous, even for experienced outdoors people. "Boone will be ready to move. He's probably been watching for me since yesterday." The journey back to where he'd left his faithful companion took most of the morning, with Emma proving to be as skilled a mountain traveler as anyone Jeremiah had ever encountered. She moved through the rough terrain with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades learning every trail and landmark in this area. Mary stayed behind at the cabin, citing the need to prepare for the storm that was obviously building. They found Boone exactly where Jeremiah had left him, alert and anxious, but unharmed. The old dog's tail wagged with desperate enthusiasm when he saw his master, but his attention quickly shifted to Emma. For a moment, man and daughter held their breath, wondering how the hound would react to this stranger. Boone approached Emma cautiously, sniffing carefully at her extended hand. Then, as if recognizing something familiar in her scent or manner, his tail began wagging again. He pressed against her legs in the same trusting way he'd always greeted people he considered family. He knows, Emma said wonderingly, scratching behind the dog's ears. Somehow he knows who I am. Dogs remember more than we give them credit for, Jeremiah replied, watching his two remaining family members bond. He was just a pup when you disappeared, but he spent years helping me search for you. Maybe he remembers your scent from all those times we followed trails that might have led to you. The journey back to the valley took longer than the outbound trip, partly because of Boone's age, but mainly because they weren't in a hurry. This was time for Jeremiah and Emma to talk privately, to fill in details and share thoughts that hadn't seemed appropriate with Mary present. "What happens now?" Emma asked as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "I don't know," Jeremiah admitted. "I've spent 30 years living for the moment when I'd find you. I never planned for what would come after." "I've been thinking about that," Emma said. "About how we build a relationship as adults, how we include Mary in your life, how we deal with practical things, like where we all live." Jeremiah had been wrestling with the same questions. His cabin was too small for 3 people, and he doubted Emma and Mary would be willing to abandon the homestead they'd spent years perfecting. But the idea of returning to his solitary existence now that he'd found his family felt impossible. "I could build an addition to your cabin," he suggested. "Add some rooms, maybe a separate entrance, so we'd have privacy when we needed it, but could be together when we wanted to." Emma's face lit up with enthusiasm. "You'd want to live with us, even after everything you've learned? Emma, you're my daughter and Mary's my granddaughter. Where else would I want to live?" They were nearing the valley when Emma stopped suddenly, pointing toward a figure walking up the trail toward them. It was Catherine Mills, carrying what looked like a heavy pack and moving with the purposeful stride of someone on an important mission. "Mr. Pike," Catherine called when she spotted them. "I was hoping I'd find you here. Is everything all right?" Jeremiah asked as she approached. "Everything's fine. Better than fine, actually." Catherine's expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she carried significant news. "I have something that belongs to Emma." She opened her pack and withdrew a wooden box, plain but well made, with Emma's name carved into its lid. "This was my father's. I found it hidden in his cabin after he died, but I wasn't sure if Emma would want it or if it would just cause more pain." Emma accepted the box with trembling hands, recognizing the carving as Thomas Brennan's work. She opened it carefully, revealing a collection of items that made her gasp with surprise and emotion. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, showing Emma at various ages throughout her captivity. But these weren't the documentation of a crime. They were family photos, carefully composed and lovingly preserved, showing Emma learning to cook, working in the garden, celebrating birthdays, holding baby Mary. They were the record of a life, strange and isolated though it had been. At the bottom of the box was a letter, written in Brennan's careful handwriting and addressed to Emma. She read it silently, tears streaming down her face, before handing it to Jeremiah. The letter was an apology and an explanation, written during Brennan's final illness, when he knew he was dying. He acknowledged the wrongness of what he'd done, the pain he'd caused not just Emma, but her entire family. But he also expressed his gratitude for the love she'd given him despite everything, and his hope that someday she'd be able to reconnect with her original family. "He kept pictures of you too," Catherine told Jeremiah, indicating several photographs of him during his search years. "He used to watch you sometimes from a distance. I think he felt guilty about what he'd stolen from you, but he could never figure out how to make it right." The knowledge that Brennan had observed him during his searches, had seen the pain his actions had caused, but had been too cowardly or confused to act, filled Jeremiah with a complex mixture of anger and pity. The man had clearly suffered from his own choices, but that suffering could never balance the scales of what he'd done. "Why are you showing us this now?" Emma asked Catherine. "Because I think you both need to understand that my father wasn't a monster, even though he did monstrous things. He was a broken man who made terrible choices, but he loved you in his own twisted way. And toward the end, He regretted those choices deeply. As if summoned by the emotional weight of the moment, the first snowflakes of the approaching storm began to fall. They were large, wet flakes that suggested the weather was about to become serious. "We need to get to shelter," Jeremiah said. Looking at the rapidly darkening sky, they made the final push to the valley as the storm intensified, arriving at the cabin just as the snow began to fall in earnest. Mary had prepared for their return, with hot soup waiting and the fire built up against the cold. That evening, as the storm raged outside, the three of them sat around the fire, while Jeremiah read aloud from one of the books in Emma's collection, a volume of poetry that she'd treasured during her years of isolation. Boone lay contentedly at his feet, finally reunited with the family he'd helped search for across decades of mountain wilderness. "This feels right," Mary said quietly, as her grandfather finished a particularly beautiful poem about finding home in unexpected places. "It does," Emma agreed, looking around at the cabin that now held 3 generations of her family. Jeremiah nodded, understanding that this moment, sitting by the fire with his daughter and granddaughter while snow fell outside and his old dog dozed peacefully, was worth 30 years of searching. The family that had been torn apart by one man's twisted actions had been rebuilt into something different, but equally precious. Outside, the mountain wind howled through the pines, but inside the warm cabin, 3 people who'd found their way back to each other sat in comfortable silence, finally at peace. The long search was over. The healing could begin. And in the morning, they would start building a new life together, one that honored both the past they'd lost and the future they'd found. Rebecca sat on the mantelpiece above the fire, her button eye reflecting the dancing flames, a silent witness to the reunion she'd helped orchestrate. After 30 years of keeping secrets, the mountain had finally given up its greatest treasure. A daughter returned to her father. Her family made whole again, despite everything that had tried to tear it apart. The storm would pass, as storms always did in this country. But the love that filled this cabin would endure, strengthened by the trials that had tested it and proven it unbreakable. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the years they'd lost, but the years they now had ahead of them together at last.